Yeah, so we'll continue looking at the book of Genesis, and okay. So I hope everybody can see the screen and hear my voice. Okay,
Mhm.
all right. So what we saw last time in the last three, four sessions was God created the heavens and the earth. God kept man and woman in the Garden of Eden. They sinned and they fell away from God, and we are now coming. Uh, we saw God's punishment or the curse that He put upon mankind, and we saw how the way it is written in a poetic way. We saw that how it grieved God's heart that man sinned against Him and corrupted the creation. So now, last week we very quickly looked at three incidents, but this time we will again go through it because I went through it very quickly. So we'll go through it, and hopefully today we'll finish the whole book, rest of the chapter. So in chapters 4 to 11, this is after the fall and before the flood. Many centuries are covered in these chapters between chapter 4 and chapter 11, and there are many people on the earth, but three people and three incidents are important to God, and that is what will be mentioned in these chapters. So the people are Cain, the Noah, and Nimrod. These people are their incidents are mentioned in these chapters. So now when we look at Cain, we see that Cain and Abel, we know the story. Cain and Abel brought sacrifice before God. Abel brought the firstborn of the flock, and Cain brought the fruit of the ground, basically vegetables and fruits. Okay. And God did not accept Cain's sacrifice, and God accepted Abel's sacrifice. And this made Cain very angry. And can we read Genesis chapter 4, verse 7? Genesis chapter 4, verse 7.
If thou dost well, shalt thou not be accepted? And if thou dost not well, sin lieth at the door, and unto thee shall be his desire, and thou shalt rule over him.
Yeah, so when Cain got dismayed and dejected, God talked with Cain, and he asked this one question: if you do well, won't you be accepted? So basically, we don't make the rules, God does. And we have the choice of either we accept it or we reject it. We can't modify or change the rules according to our liking. If God required a blood sacrifice, we cannot bring fruits and vegetables in His presence. Later, we see during Moses' time, we see Aaron's sons offering, it says, strange fire before God, not according to what God had, instructed, and they were struck dead. So we understand from this that God makes the rule. We need to follow those rules. Many times when things go wrong in our life, we kind of get angry with God. And it could be because of our own mistakes that we are suffering different problems. But again, there is this same question God can ask us. If you do well, won't you be accepted? Okay. If we abide by the rules, if we abide by what, it's not that every suffering is a judgment from God, but I'm just saying in general, if there could be such questions that God can ask us. Okay, we instead of us getting angry before God, it would do us well if we introspect our life, and instead of taking up the attitude which Cain had. Now, Cain's contribution. Now, because of his murder of his brother, God put a punishment upon Cain, and Cain said, that's way too much for me to handle. Now we read in Genesis chapter 4, verse 17 to 22, we read about Cain's lineage, Cain's descendants, and we see some things emerging in those lines. We see music. It says in verse 21. His brother's name was Jubal. He was the father of all those who play the lyre and pipe. And there's another one who was the forger of instruments of bronze and iron. And we can see then there is Lamech, who married two wives. Till that time, it was one man and one woman for their entire life. But we now see that in Cain's lineage, there is a person who takes two wives. So we see music coming up, we see metallurgy coming up, we see polygamy coming up. And it says Cain established a city. We see urbanization coming up. Okay, so we see these different things that we see even today coming up in Cain's lineage. And there is also another thing we see. Cain murdered his brother because he envied him. And that too still continues today. Jesus said, if they have hated me, they will also hate you. Jesus was a righteous man. He did not harm anyone. He did not do wrong against anyone. He did good to the people. He healed people. He spoke the truth. He spoke about God. And yet people hated him. And they wanted him crucified. So Jesus said, if they have hated me, they will hate you also. So we see this pattern emerging right from the very beginning of Genesis. Then we see in Genesis chapter 4, verse 25, that Adam had another son, and his name was Seth. And Seth was exactly lookalike of Adam that we see in the later chapter. Okay, and he was a godly line. He was a godly line of people, and it says at that time, people began to call upon the name of the Lord. Worship started. People started worshiping God. So there is this one line which is going into urbanization, polygamy, and all kinds of things. And there is this another line of people from Seth who are worshiping God. So there is these two lines of two different kinds of people living on the earth. As it was then, so is it now. Okay. Now, going further ahead, the next incident so Cain affected God a lot. So that's why he is mentioned. As we saw in the earlier sessions, that what's written in the Bible are things that are important to God. Okay. It's affected him. It matters to him. So Cain affected God. What he did affected God. Okay, the kind of sin he did grieved God, and therefore he is mentioned. Then we come to Noah. Genesis chapter 6, verse 5 and 6. Can we read that? Genesis chapter 6, verse 5 and 6.
And God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his hearts was only evil continually, and it repented the Lord that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him at his heart.
So it says these words which I highlighted last time. So this is man had turned away from God's image and likeness in such a bad and drastic way that these are the words that are being used to describe him. Only, continually. Every intention of his heart is only evil, nothing good, only evil, and it is continually, okay? It is continually evil. And so much is his depravity that the God of the universe, in chapter 1 we saw that such a powerful and creative and loving God, he was grieved in his heart and he regretted that he ever made man. So the amount of effect that we as a people, we as an individual can have on God can be reflected here. What we do, what we think, what we behave matters to the God of this universe. It is very, very important to him. And he regretted that he made man. And in Genesis chapter 6, we see a certain event that is happening. In verse 6, chapter 6, verse 11, it says, the earth was filled with violence. Okay. And there is this incident that is mentioned in verse in that chapter, that the angels of God came upon earth and they married with human women and they had offspring. Okay. And these were, the chapter says, the mighty men of old. Okay. And it also mentions not only in those days, but also afterwards. So the problem did not get resolved with the flood. These angels came and interfered with the human line even after the flood. So, and this incident is mentioned in far more detail in the book of Enoch. Now, the book of Enoch is not part of our Bible. It is part of, I think it is part of the Catholic Bible or Apocrypha. But a couple of those verses are mentioned in our Bible as the prophecy of Enoch, that the Lord will come and he will, with his, I forget exact words, but the Lord will come to judge the earth. So that prophecy, which is mentioned in the book of Enoch, is mentioned in our Bible. And that book is quite famous, and it was famous in, quite well known during the New Testament times. So these are the incidents that happened, and because of this depravity, this breaking of order that God had created, okay, the earth was filled with violence. And God decided to end it all, to finish it all. So he decided to bring a flood. We know the story. And God gave 120 years to earth to repent while Noah prepared the ark. Now unto Enoch, who was at that time, a son was born, and his name was Methuselah. And the name of Methuselah means, when he dies, it shall happen. So Enoch named his son Methuselah because he knew God was going to judge the earth. Okay. And he knew that when Methuselah dies, that is when the judgment will happen. And when we look at the number of years of life, and we'll find that in the year that Methuselah died, that was the year when the flood came to the earth. And we will see another thing, that Methuselah is the one who lived the longest among all the early people, because God wanted to show mercy to the earth, and he wanted to extend his mercy as long as possible. So Methuselah is an example of God's extended mercy on human life, on how he wishes to show mercy and how he wishes that people would repent and turn back to him. Now, after the flood, there are a few things that happen. We can read that account in Genesis chapter 9, verse 1 to 17. First thing is, God promises to support all life. We will read one verse, Genesis chapter 8, verse 21 and 22. Genesis chapter 8, verse 21 and 22. Can somebody read that?
And
Genesis chapter 8.
And the Lord smelled a sweet savor, and the Lord said in his heart, I will not again curse the ground any more for man's sake, for the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth. Neither will he again smite any more everything, neither will I gain smite any more, everything living, as I have done. Verse 22 as well. Yeah? While the
Yes.
earth remaineth, seed time and harvest, and cold and heat, and summer and winter, and day and night shall not cease.
So God makes a promise that while the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. He promised us to support all life. He will say he will never again destroy it with a flood. Then in the next chapter, in the beginning, we see God commands Noah to treat every human life as precious. Anyone who takes away human life must be punished by taking away his life. Okay, so God is commanding people to treat human life as very, very precious. Thirdly, we see a covenant, a sign of the covenant that God creates. That is the rainbow. In Genesis chapter 9, verse 13 to 14, we see that God says this rainbow is a sign of the covenant. And it is a sign for not for us that we should not fear, but it is a sign for God. If we read Genesis chapter 9, verse 13 and 14, it says, when I bring clouds over the earth and the bow is seen in the clouds, I will remember my covenant. So when God sees the rainbow, he will remember the covenant. So it's a sign before God and for God to remember that he will never again destroy the earth by a flood. So these are some of the things that happens after the flood. Also, two other things happen. One thing is God says, I will put the fear of you in all the animals. Now the animal world will fear mankind. Secondly, God says you can start eating flesh, which was not there before. Earlier, man was consuming fruits and a vegetarian diet. But after the flood, God allows man to start eating meat. Okay, so two different things happen at the end of the flood. Third thing that happened is of Nimrod. Genesis chapter 11. Now, if we look at Genesis chapter 10, verse 10, can we read? It says about the cities that Nimrod built. Genesis chapter 10, verse 10. Can we read that?
At the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, and Erech, and Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar.
Yeah, so it mentions the land of Shinar, it mentions the city of Babel. So we see that the Tower of Babel is mentioned in chapter 11, but it never mentions that Nimrod is the one who created it, created the tower. But here in chapter 10, it mentions that Babel is one of the cities that Nimrod built and ruled. So by tradition, it is assumed that Nimrod is the one who initiated and wanted to build this tower that would rise up to heaven. And, it was a kind of rebellion against God. And extra biblical records, if we read, it will say that Nimrod wanted revenge against God for killing his forefathers. And those were some of the things. Some of the other records mention that Nimrod wanted to put astrological signs upon the tower that he built, and interact with fallen angels. So there are different extra biblical records. We don't have any of those things mentioned in the Bible, but definitely God did not approve of this project. Now, God doesn't have anything against tall buildings. Okay, it was not the height of the building that was annoying to God. Okay, because we have far more taller buildings in, say, Newcastle itself, probably. We don't know. But all over the world, we have very tall buildings. But that's not a problem to God. It was the intention and the motive with which it was being built, the attitude with which it was being built, that that God did not approve of. And so God confuses the language over there. Now, again, God does not utterly wipe them off. God shows mercy, and he just confuses the language so that just the project just comes to a stop. Okay. Now, God, what we see in this chapters is that God will deal with the situation. He will not let it go. We see that in Cain and Noah and Nimrod, but we also see God's mercy. We see that God made clothes for Adam and Eve. We see that God, even though punished Cain, he put a mark on Cain so that nobody else harasses him. We see the ark for Noah, even though it was open for everyone, nobody went in, and he did not utterly destroy the people at Babel. So even through the judgment and the punishment of God, there is always his hand of mercy. Okay, like a father who wants the children to turn back. Okay, he wants the people to turn back to him. So that is Nimrod. Now, chapter 12 to 50 is another section. Okay, 4 to 11 is one section. 12 to 50 is another section. So till 4 to 11, we saw the entire mankind and how God dealt with entire mankind. Now, when we come to chapter 12 to 50, we see that God zooms himself down to one particular nation or one particular family, very specifically one particular family. So in those times, each nation had a god. Okay, and so that meant that religion was national, and every war was a war between gods. And we see about that in later in First Kings and Chronicles, that some of the nations mention that their god is a god of hills. Let's fight them in the plains, then we will defeat them. And all those kind of talk we hear. So every war was a war between the gods of the nation. That's how it was viewed. Now, Israel made some particular claim. Their claim was this, that the God of the entire universe is their God. So the God that they serve, the God of Israel, is the God who created the whole universe. Secondly, they claim that every other God is a figment of imagination. We read that in Psalms and Isaiah. Okay, and we read about that, in fact, even in Job, I think, that every other God is a figment of imagination, is non-existent. There is only one God, and that is the God of Israel. And they further claim that this God made a personal relationship with them, with the Jewish people. And particularly, God of the whole universe identifies himself as God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now, when we hear this, we can imagine how offensive it is to other nations. Okay, then they begin to hate Israel because of such claims. So we see that God, from chapter 12 to 50, God concentrates himself to one family, and that is the family of Abraham. The timeline that we see, Genesis chapter 12 to 50, covers longer part of the book, but is of a short period, only 4 generations and years. Genesis 1 to 11 cover many centuries, but it is only 25% or less than 25% of the book. Chapter 12 to 36, we see about God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Chapter 37 to 50 is all about Joseph, but God doesn't call him God of Joseph. Okay, rather we see that Joseph is of God, Joseph of God. That's what we see the picture. And these are stories. These are ordinary stories, means these are ordinary people. They are born, they marry, they die, they quarrel, they cheat, just like everybody else. They raise cattle, they do business. Okay, they have all their differences and all these things. But what is Why are they special? Because every other family in their time did the same thing. The difference is that God talks to them and they talk to God. That is the one key difference and the important difference between this family and every other family. Otherwise, the stories that we read are very ordinary stories of people getting born, getting married, and living and becoming rich and getting cheated and all these different things. Now, why did God choose them? Why did God choose Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? And there is a lot of different talks about it, but just in short, it was God's sovereign choice. They did not choose God. God initiated this relationship. So when we say God's sovereign choice, we are saying that God has the absolute right and authority to do anything according to his will, and nobody can oppose it. He has the right and he can do it. So it is God's sovereign choice. Okay, it is not a random choice. It is not some, haphazard choice. It is his own willful choice, and because it is God, it is God's sovereign choice. And the next thing we read is in each generation, God chose the younger one. And it showed that no one has a natural right or claim over his love. The elder cannot say that I am the elder, therefore God must talk to me. Okay, he always chose the younger one to show that no one has a natural right or a moral right to claim over his love. The reason for moral right is none of these three people in the generation were so good at some or the other points in their life. Jacob was the worst. Abraham and Isaac lied about their wives just to save their own life. Jacob was a cheater and a schemer, and he was paid in full in his life. But these were ordinary people, not different from other people. So they all had but one thing in common. They believed God. They had faith. So it just shows that how much God values faith. Okay. God can do more with somebody who believes in him than with a moral person, than with a good person. God wants somebody who will believe in him, and God can do much through that person than somebody who is a moral person. Now, they showed their faith in different ways, all these three generations, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Abraham lived in the Ur of the Chaldees, and he was 75 years old when he left the Ur of the Chaldees. And this is a picture of the fireplace they used in Ur in their houses. Okay, so this is a 75-year-old man sitting in front of a fireplace, warm and cozy and happy in a well-developed city, an advanced city in their times. And God tells this old man, leave your father's house, your country, go into the place I am telling you, and you will live your entire life in tents. Okay, you are going to leave the comfort of your concrete house or their well-built house, and you're going to start living in tents. And Abraham showed his faith by leaving the Ur of Chaldees and following God's command. And because he did that, that's why all of us are here today. All of us are able to worship God, because one old man decided to believe God and obey God. So Isaac showed his faith by, Abraham again showed his faith by, he was willing to sacrifice Isaac. Hebrews chapter 11 verse 17 to 19 says, Abraham believed that God could raise Isaac back from the dead, because he did a similar miracle for Abraham. It says Abraham's body was as good as dead, but God brought life back into him. And Abraham believed, if God could do that to me, he could bring Isaac also back from the dead. Isaac showed his faith by not resisting his own sacrifice. So the Jewish people believe that Isaac was roughly in his 30s when Abraham took him for sacrifice. He was not a 12-year or 13-year-old boy. He was strong enough to resist Abraham and get out from the altar. But he did not resist, and he lay himself down on the altar. He also accepted the wife of God's choice. He did not go choosing his own wife. Okay, so Abraham showed his faith. Jacob showed his faith by believing and caring about the blessing so much that he cheated his own brother. Now, all these three people are contrasted with another of their relative. Abraham is contrasted with Lot. Lot chose the green valley and went after what was good to his eyes. Abraham chose the opposite. Isaac is contrasted against Ishmael. God blesses Ishmael. He is the father of Arab nation. God prospers him, but he's not the chosen one. God does not just let go of Ishmael, he blesses him. But Isaac is the chosen one. Isaac submitted himself to Abraham. Ishmael, it is says he will be a wild donkey. Okay, his hand will be against everyone and everyone will be against him. Jacob is contrasted against Esau. Esau despised his birthright and wanted immediate gratification. And we can see that this relationship comes closer and closer. Abraham and Lot were uncle and nephew. Isaac and Ishmael were brothers, stepbrothers. Jacob and Esau were twins. So we see the faith and flesh in contrast, and we saw the choices made by each of these men. The next story that comes is from chapter 37 onwards, and this is about Joseph. The difference in Joseph's story is that just one more point about the contrast, that in the blessings that God gave to these three generations, their relatives were not included. Lot was not included in the blessing. Ishmael was not included in the blessing. Esau was not included in the blessing. But when we look at Joseph, we again see that even though he is not the eldest, his brothers are included in the blessing. Okay, God never appears to Joseph. Okay, but he speaks to him through dreams, but we never hear God appearing to Joseph like he appeared to Abraham and to Isaac. Joseph is again not the eldest. Okay, but Joseph seems to stand on his own. Okay, so we can look at Joseph as a human story, the fall and the rise from prisoner to prince. Okay, as the fall and rise of Joseph. We can also see it as God's story. God is behind everything that happens to Joseph. He puts people at the right places. He puts people in the, he provides for Joseph. He gives him favor. And he put the baker and the cupbearer in the same place where Joseph putting people together. So providence. We see God's providence in Joseph's story. We see him orchestrating different things. Okay, can we read Genesis chapter 45, verse 7? Genesis chapter 45, verse 7.
And God sent me before you to preserve you with prosperity in the earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance.
So here we read, Joseph understands something. All the troubles that he went through, after all the betrayal, all the pain, and all the false accusations that he went through, he did not have bitterness against the ones who did that. Okay, he says, God sent me before you. He was sold into Egypt by his brothers, but he says, God sent me. He did not say, you did this to me. He says, God sent me. And one of the reasons that God took Joseph so high in position and his will was fulfilled was because he did not bear a grudge. Just imagine, with all the power that Joseph had, if he had carried a grudge against his brothers, he would have destroyed them. But Joseph understood God's plan and he said, God sent me before you so that I could preserve you. so that I could protect you. These are the brothers who almost killed him. And it takes a very different kind of nature to say this kind of things. We carry offenses, words which people have spoken against us. We carry those words for years. And Joseph was so badly mistreated. But he says, God sent me ahead. It takes a different kind of mind to say that kind of sentence. And because Joseph had that heart and that mind, God took him so high because he knew he could trust Joseph with that power. He will not destroy God's plan. Because if he had been a person who bore grudge, then God would not have raised him because he would have destroyed his brothers. So we see Joseph understanding God's plan. Now we see some things in Joseph's character. First, he was a favorite son. Second, there is no criticism of him of any kind in the Bible. We have criticism of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, but there is no criticism of any kind against Joseph. Joseph doesn't give in to temptation. He goes all the way down and then rises all the way up to the top. And then he forgives his brothers and preserves them. He intercedes for them before Pharaoh. So we can see a picture appearing over here. And that is a picture of Jesus Christ. He is the one, the Father's firstborn. There is no blame on him. There is no kind of criticism against him. He did not give in to the devil's temptation. He went all the way down to the cross. Now he's all the way up, a name above all names. And he forgiven us and he intercedes for us at all times and has reconciled us to the Father. So we see this type of Christ appearing in the life of Joseph. And we see this instance of types appearing in different places in the book of Genesis. Now, there is one more last point that I wanted to speak, and that is in Genesis chapter 15, verse 16. Can we read that? Genesis chapter 15, verse 16.
But in the fourth generation they shall come hither again, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full.
So the Amorites were the people who were living in the land God promised to Abraham. And God says to Abraham, your descendants will be slaves in Egypt for 400 years, and after that they will come back, because the sin of the Amorites are not yet complete. So the point is, even though God promised the land to Israel, to Abraham, the original inhabitants of the land, God will not cast them out of that land till they themselves forfeit that right because of their sin. And then it is just a judgment to move them from their land. And we see the same thing. God speaks to Israel later in Exodus and other books that I am removing this people because of their sin. And if you do the same thing, you also will be removed. In the gist of that is there in the other book. So God gave that land to Israel, but he would not let them enter there or take possession of it till the original inhabitants lost the right to live in that land. So we see that God proves that he is the owner of all things. We are just tenants. We have to obey the rules that he has set forth. Now, these are the things that we see in the book of Genesis. The last thing was about Joseph's character and the type of Christ. And we see that type of Christ appearing in different instances where Isaac submits himself for the sacrifice. We see a ram that was taken to substitute for Isaac's sacrifice. It says a ram caught in thorns. And it is the same hill, the hill of Moriah, that later became the hill of Golgotha. And where Abraham sacrificed Isaac, in that place we see the ram of God with his head caught in thorns on the cross. We see early ahead in chapter 1, God says to the serpent, in the early chapter, God says to the serpent, the son of the woman will crush your head. That is a mention of Christ who was to come and who will deal with the finality to sin. And he's the us. He's one of the us. When God says, let us make man, he is there in that us, in that word us. So we see Christ appearing in Genesis at different places. So that is the overview of the book of Genesis. And when we read the book, I hope that we can keep this overview in our mind, and that book will be again a blessing for all of us. God bless us.